Have you ever wondered why so many first-time buyers feel like they made a good deal, only to realize later that they actually overpaid? Not slightly, not marginally, but significantly. And the most frustrating part? They usually don't realize it at the moment of purchase. They only realize it after the excitement fades, after the papers are signed, after the emotional high wears off and reality starts to settle in, and by then it's too late to go back. So the real question becomes, why does this happen so consistently? Why do intelligent, careful, well-meaning buyers repeatedly end up paying more than they should? And more importantly, how do you avoid becoming one of them? To understand that, we need to slow everything down and look at what actually happens during a first-time purchase decision. Because what looks like a financial decision on the surface is actually a psychological process underneath. Most people assume buying property is about logic. Numbers, comparisons, research, and while those things matter, they are not what drives the final decision in most cases. Emotion does, pressure does, perception does, and timing does. And those four forces together explain almost every overpayment scenario in the real estate world. Let's start with the first and most powerful one, emotion. The moment a first-time buyer walks into a property, something changes. It stops being abstract, it stops being theoretical. It becomes real. You can see it. You can imagine living in it. You can picture your future inside it. And that shift is extremely powerful. Because at that moment, the brain is no longer evaluating purely as an investor. It is imagining as a resident. And those are two completely different mental states. An investor asks, "Is this worth the price based on market value?" A buyer asks, "Can I see myself living here?" And when those two perspectives conflict, emotion often wins because imagination is immediate. And comparison requires effort, so the first silent mistake happens right there. The property becomes yours emotionally before it is justified financially, and once that happens, objectivity starts to weaken. Then comes the second factor, urgency. Real estate markets are structured around limited availability. There is always the idea that someone else might buy it, that it might disappear, that hesitation equals loss. This creates what is known in behavioral economics as scarcity pressure, and scarcity changes decision-making. When something feels limited, the brain assigns it higher value, not necessarily real value, perceived value. And perceived value often overrides logical valuation. So even if a property is slightly overpriced, the fear of losing it can push a buyer to accept it anyway. Not because they analyzed it incorrectly, but because they didn't want to miss the opportunity. This is where first-time buyers often make their second major mistake. They confuse competition with value. Just because other people are interested does not mean the price is justified. But in the moment, competition feels like validation, and validation feels like confirmation, and confirmation feels like safety, so decisions get pushed forward faster than they should. Then comes the third factor, information imbalance. Sellers and agents typically have more experience in pricing structures, negotiation ranges, and market behavior. First-time buyers do not. This creates a natural imbalance. And in any negotiation where one side understands the system better, they have an advantage. This does not mean sellers are doing anything unethical. It simply means they understand the structure better. They know how long properties stay on the market. They know how pricing trends fluctuate. They know what buyers are likely to accept emotionally. And most importantly, they know how to frame value. Because value is not just numbers, it is presentation. Two identical properties can feel completely different depending on how they are presented. One might feel like a deal, the other might feel slightly overpriced, even if they are mathematically similar. This is where perception becomes more powerful than data, and most first-time buyers are not trained to separate the two. Now, let's go deeper. One of the most overlooked reasons people overpay is anchoring. Anchoring happens when the first price you see becomes your mental reference point. If a property is listed at a certain price, your brain uses that as the baseline. Even if the true market value is lower, even if comparable properties are cheaper, even if negotiation is possible, that first number sticks, and everything else is judged relative to it. So instead of asking, Eti, is this property worth this price? The brain starts asking, is this a good deal compared to the listed price? And those are completely different questions. One is objective, one is relative, and relative thinking is where overpayment begins, because a discount from an inflated price still leaves you overpaying. But emotionally, it feels like winning. Now, let's talk about timing. Timing is one of the most underestimated factors in real estate decisions. First-time buyers often make decisions under pressure. They feel like they need to act quickly. They fear missing out. They fear rising prices. They fear being left behind. And fear accelerates decision-making. But accelerated decisions reduce analytical depth. When decisions are rushed, fewer comparisons are made, fewer alternatives are explored, fewer negotiations happen, and that creates a higher likelihood of accepting suboptimal pricing. Now, at this point, a pattern becomes clear. Overpayment is rarely caused by a single mistake. It is caused by a combination of psychological and informational pressures. Emotion pulls the buyer in, urgency pushes the buyer forward, information imbalance reduces clarity, anchoring distorts perception, and competition reinforces justification. Together, these forces create a decision environment where overpayment feels normal, even reasonable, even justified. But once you understand the structure, something changes. You start seeing the process differently. You stop reacting emotionally to properties, and you start analyzing them structurally. So, how do experienced buyers avoid overpaying? They slow down the decision loop. They separate emotional response from financial evaluation. They compare multiple properties before forming attachment. They study market averages instead of relying on listing prices. And most importantly, they detach urgency from value, because urgency is not value, scarcity is not value, and competition is not value. Value is determined by comparison, timing, condition, and long-term potential, not emotional pressure in the moment. Another key strategy is understanding true market range, not asking, what is the asking price, but instead asking, what is the realistic price range this property should fall into based on similar sales? That shift alone changes everything, because it removes anchoring, it introduces external reference points, and it restores objectivity. Now, let's talk about negotiation, because this is where many first-time buyers lose additional money without realizing it. Most buyers either do not negotiate at all, or negotiate emotionally instead of strategically. They either accept the first offer or make reactive counteroffers without data backing. But negotiation in real estate is not about pressure, it is about positioning. Understanding demand, understanding time on market, understanding seller motivation, and aligning offer strategy accordingly. The goal is not to win the negotiation, the goal is to reach fair market alignment. Now, another hidden factor is emotional attachment during inspection. Once a buyer imagines themselves living in a space, objectivity decreases. They begin to mentally move in before ownership is secured. This creates psychological ownership, and psychological ownership increases willingness to pay, even beyond rational limits. That is why experienced buyers often maintain emotional distance during early stages. They evaluate first, they attach later, not the other way around. Now, let's bring everything together. Most first-time buyers overpay not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack effort, not because they lack access to information, but because the buying environment is designed to influence perception, emotionally, psychologically, structurally. And unless a buyer is aware of these influences, they operate inside them unconsciously. But awareness changes everything. Once you understand how emotion, urgency, anchoring, scarcity, and information imbalance interact, you stop making reactive decisions, and you start making informed ones. And informed decisions are almost always closer to fair value, not inflated value, not emotional value, but real value. So the final takeaway is simple but powerful. Overpaying is not a financial mistake first, it is a psychological one. And once you recognize the psychology behind it, you gain control over the financial outcome. Because the moment you stop reacting and start evaluating, you stop being influenced by the system, and start navigating it. And that is exactly how first-time buyers avoid overpaying, not by finding perfect properties, but by understanding how perception shapes price and how awareness protects value.